In the shocked days after Pearl Harbor, while Japanese naval flags waved high across the Pacific, the top military leaders in Tokyo gathered to ask one simple question that would change everything. What do we do next? Maps covered the tables. Victories were counted. But one man in that room knew something the others didn't. And it wasn't about the ships he'd just destroyed at Pearl Harbor. It was about the country he had just woken up. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant mind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, had a warning for his commanders that wasn't just cautious. It was a frightening truth that would shake them to their core, because he was about to tell them that invading the United States was already impossible, and the reasons why had almost nothing to do with the American military. This is the story of what Japan's leaders said behind closed doors, and what they truly feared when they realized America could never be conquered. In those final days of 1941, the mood in Tokyo was electric with confidence. The Empire of Japan stood at the peak of its power, and from their view, the attack on Pearl Harbor had been a massive success, crippling America's Pacific Fleet in one swift strike. General Hideki Tojo, the Prime Minister, and the hardline military leaders saw a clear path to victory. Their armies were sweeping across Southeast Asia. Hong Kong was falling. Malaya was collapsing. The Philippines were being overrun. Everything was falling like dominoes. The British were struggling. The Dutch were in chaos. And America, they believed, had just been knocked to its knees. This was what they called the victory disease, a wave of dangerous overconfidence that swept through Japanese command. They had started believing their own propaganda, convinced that their warrior spirit was somehow spiritually superior to what they saw as the soft, comfort-loving culture of the West. They looked at Americans as shopkeepers and farmers, not real fighters, a divided nation that would surely give up once their fleet was destroyed, unwilling to pay the terrible price of war. Their whole strategy was built on this belief. They called it the Kessin Plan, and it was simple. One big naval battle, one winner-take-all fight, that would devastate the American Navy so badly that Washington would have no choice but to negotiate peace, leaving Japan as the unquestionable master of Asia and the Pacific. But inside the heavily guarded walls of Japan's military headquarters, one man wasn't celebrating. He knew the truth. Admiral Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet and the very architect of Pearl Harbor, was perhaps the most American-educated man in the entire Japanese government, and this made him a walking contradiction. A devoted patriot who deeply mistrusted his own army's aggressive plans. A brilliant naval strategist who now feared he had sealed his nation's fate. You see, Yamamoto hadn't just visited America. He had lived there. He studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, then served as a naval attaché in Washington. But he hadn't just seen the monuments and met with politicians. He had traveled the country, driven from coast to coast, seen the small towns and vast farmlands and roaring factories of the industrial heartland. He spoke English, read American newspapers, and understood the American mind in a way that Tojo and the army generals simply couldn't grasp. While others celebrated their victory, Yamamoto was writing in his diary, and he wrote words that would become famous. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." But the high command was already looking past their current strategy. They were studying maps and asking the next logical question. What if we don't just defeat America? What if we actually invade them? What would it take to land Japanese soldiers on the beaches of California? This is where the real story begins, because when Yamamoto was pressed on this exact question, his answer wasn't based on naval charts or troop numbers. It was based on something he had seen with his own eyes in hardware stores in Montana, in the fields of the Midwest, and in the stubborn character of the American people. The generals in Tokyo saw America as a target to conquer, but Yamamoto saw it as an impossible fortress. And the first shocking thing he told them wasn't about battleships or secret air bases, it was about the American people themselves. In 1940s Japan, the relationship between citizens and the government was total obedience. After their government modernization in the late 1800s, they had systematically taken weapons away from regular people. The old warrior class had their swords confiscated. Owning a gun wasn't a right. It was a rare privilege granted only by the state. The army was the only group with real firepower. This was how Japanese generals saw the world. An army fights an army, and civilians simply bow to their new masters. But Yamamoto had to shatter this belief. He had to explain to a room of confused commanders what he had witnessed in America, and what he told them must have seemed unbelievable. He explained that in the United States, weapons weren't just for soldiers. He had seen hardware stores in tiny country towns that sold rifles and shotguns right next to hammers and nails. He had seen sporting goods stores where any man could walk in and buy a gun with ammunition. He described a culture where fathers taught their sons to hunt, where being a good shot was a point of pride, a tradition passed down from a frontier heritage that was, at that time, only a generation or two old. He wasn't talking about a few thousand hobby shooters. The intelligence reports were staggering. In a nation of 130 million people, there were believed to be around 50 million guns already in the hands of regular citizens. This was a concept the high command could barely process. So what? One general might have argued, "They're not trained soldiers, they're just regular people." And Yamamoto's reply, as history remembers it, was chilling. He is famously quoted as saying, "You cannot invade the mainland United States. There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass." Think about what that simple sentence really meant. It wasn't a military calculation. It was about society itself. He was painting a picture of an invasion unlike any in human history. It wouldn't be army against army fighting for control of a capital city. It would be an army fighting an entire population. Every farmhouse would become a sniper position, every town a stronghold, every highway a potential ambush point. Japanese soldiers, trained for big battles on open fields or in jungle warfare, would be thrust into a 3,000-mile-long nightmare. They wouldn't be fighting a regular army that would surrender when its officers were captured. They would be fighting millions of individuals, farmers, factory workers, mechanics, and shopkeepers who believed with almost religious conviction that they had a God-given right to defend their own property and their own lives. This was the nightmare that Japanese military thinking couldn't handle. You break the enemy's will to fight. But how could you break the will of 100 million people fighting on their own land for their own homes? There was no surrender point, no capital to capture that would end the war. But Yamamoto's warning didn't stop there. The armed citizens were only the first layer of an impossible problem. Let's say, just for argument's sake, the Japanese Imperial Army was willing to pay that price in blood. Let's say they were prepared to lose millions of men fighting a guerrilla war against the entire American population. Now they face a problem that no amount of fighting spirit could solve. Simple mathematics. Yamamoto spread out the maps. The generals in Tokyo were used to island hopping, to fighting in China. But when they looked at the map of the United States, the reality of the geography began to sink in like cold water. Japan as a nation is a collection of islands roughly the size of California. But America was an entire continent. From the landing beaches in California to the centers of government and industry in the east, an invading army would have to cross nearly 3,000 miles, and this wasn't flat, easy land. First, they would have to fight their way over the Sierra Nevada mountains, a massive wall of granite. Then, after crossing the deserts of Nevada and Utah, they would face the Rocky Mountains, one of the most difficult mountain ranges on the planet. And even if they somehow made it past those natural fortresses, they would emerge onto the Great Plains, a vast open space stretching for 1,000 miles. And this was a death trap for logistics. An army moves on its stomach, and it fights with its supplies. Every single bullet, every bag of rice, every gallon of gas for their tanks and trucks would have to come from Japan. And this was the second great impossibility: the problem of distance. The Japanese supply line would stretch 5,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. This was an insane proposal all by itself. The United States Navy, damaged at Pearl Harbor, was already rebuilding fast. American submarines would hunt these supply convoys without mercy. The journey would take weeks, and every ship that made it through would be a miracle. Meanwhile, what about the Americans? Yamamoto had seen their internal transportation system. He had seen the web of railroads that connected the nation. The United States could move an entire army from New York to California in just days. Complete with all its tanks, artillery, and supplies, Japan's rail system was tiny and broken up by comparison, and an invading Japanese army would be stranded. They would be an island of troops in a sea of hostile territory, cut off, starved, and hunted. Every mile they pushed inland would stretch their already impossible supply lines thinner, while the Americans would only get stronger, drawing on the vast, untouched resources of their own continent. An invasion force wouldn't be able to live off the land because the land itself would be fighting them. They wouldn't be able to get new supplies because their supply line would be at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. It was a fantasy. No army in history had ever successfully projected power on such a scale against such a well-defended and massive opponent. And even this, the geography and the logistics, wasn't the giant Yamamoto truly feared. The real giant, the one he had seen in the roaring fires of Detroit and Pittsburgh, was something Japan could never hope to match. The problem wasn't just that America was big, it was what America could do. Yamamoto had to explain to the high command that their entire reason for the war was flawed. They believed they could cripple America by sinking its fleet. But Yamamoto knew that America's true power wasn't in its existing fleet. It was in its ability to build a new one, and then build another one after that. And this was the third and most terrifying impossibility: America as the factory of democracy. Let's look at the hard numbers, the kind that would have kept Yamamoto awake at night. In 1941, as Japan prepared for war, their industrial power was a tiny fraction of America's. Take steel, the very backbone of any modern war machine. The United States in 1941 produced about half of the world's steel. Japan's total output was about 10% of America's. Or consider oil, the lifeblood of tanks, planes, and ships. The United States was the world's largest producer, drawing over 60% of the world's entire supply from its own wells in Texas, Oklahoma, and California. Japan, by contrast, had almost no oil of its own. They were completely dependent on imports, the very imports America had just cut off, which is what had forced their hand to attack in the first place. The Japanese High Command knew these numbers, but they didn't understand what they meant. They believed their superior spirit could overcome a shortage of material. But Yamamoto knew this was nonsense. War, he understood, is ultimately about production, about supplies, about wearing down the enemy. And in that battle, Japan had already lost before it began. He had seen the automobile factories in Detroit. He told his fellow officers with complete honesty that the American auto industry could by itself outproduce the entire war-making ability of Nazi Germany. And he was absolutely right, because when America flipped the switch, the results were beyond anyone's imagination. The Ford Motor Company, which had perfected the assembly line for cars, built a new factory at Willow Run, and at its peak, that single factory was producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour. Think about that, a 4-engine heavy bomber, one of the most complex machines of the age, rolling off the line every 60 minutes, 24 hours a day, every day. Japan celebrated building a new aircraft carrier as a national triumph that took years. But American shipyards, like the ones run by Henry Kaiser, were applying assembly line techniques to ships. They were building Liberty cargo ships in weeks. Then they got it down to days. One ship, the Robert E. Peary, was built from the first piece of steel to launching in just 4 days and 15 hours. This was the sleeping giant. The giant wasn't just the American military, it was the American factory worker, the engineer, the farmer. It was a system that could pour out an endless flood of steel, aluminum, and oil, creating a wave of tanks, planes, and ships that would be unstoppable. And Yamamoto's plan for Pearl Harbor was never about winning a long war. It was a desperate gamble. He told the high command that he could run wild for 6 months or a year. But after that, he had no confidence in victory at all. He was hoping to cause a wound so painful, so sudden, that the Americans would simply give up. And this led to his fourth and perhaps deepest realization: the final deadly mistake made by the generals in Tokyo. They believed the American spirit was weak, but Yamamoto, the Harvard man, the student of history, knew they were dangerously wrong. And this was the fourth impossibility: completely underestimating the American character. The Japanese generals, especially those in the army, were products of a rigid, traditional system that worshipped the emperor. To them, the highest honor was to die for the emperor. Surrender was the ultimate shame. They looked at America, a loud, messy, democratic nation where people argued with their government, where individuals were celebrated, and they saw weakness. They saw a lack of unity, a lack of spiritual strength. But Yamamoto had seen something completely different. He had studied American history. He knew about the Revolutionary War, where a ragtag army of farmers and merchants fighting for a radical idea of freedom had defeated the greatest military power on earth. The British Empire. He knew about the American Civil War, a conflict that had cost more American lives than almost all their other wars combined, fought with brutal intensity over the very soul of their nation. Yamamoto understood that Americans weren't motivated by obedience to a god emperor. They were motivated by something the high command couldn't grasp: personal independence, the "don't tread on me" spirit, the deep, stubborn belief in personal freedom, and the defense of one's own home. And this, he warned, made them the most unpredictable and dangerous of enemies. A professional army like Japan's follows orders. It attacks when told, it retreats when commanded. But a nation of armed civilians fighting on their home soil doesn't follow orders from a distant general. They fight because someone is on their land. They fight for their family, their farm, their town. There's no negotiating. There's no single breaking point. In the Japanese way of war, you capture the capital, you take Tokyo, the emperor surrenders, the war is over. But in America, what would you accomplish by capturing Washington, D.C.? The government would simply move to Chicago. If you captured Chicago, they'd move to Denver. Every single state, every single county would continue to resist. The war would never end. So when the generals asked Yamamoto for his final assessment, he laid out the brutal facts. To invade the United States, Japan would need to cross 5,000 miles of ocean, hunted by submarines, to land on a hostile continent where they would be met on the beaches by not just an army, but by millions of armed citizens with better shooting skills than many of their own soldiers. If they somehow survived that, they would have to fight their way across 3,000 miles of harsh, unforgiving land, including two of the world's largest mountain ranges. Their supply lines would be non-existent, and all the while, the American manufacturing giant, a production system that dwarfed their own, would be churning out an endless supply of new tanks, new planes, and new ships, arming a population that was united not by obedience, but by a terrible determination to never, ever be conquered. The room fell silent. The victory disease was cured. The plan to invade America was quietly put away, not just as difficult, but as truly impossible. Now this entire story, this grand strategic problem, has a fascinating and dark mirror image, because the Japanese High Command had correctly identified all the reasons why invading America was impossible. But they failed to apply that same thinking to themselves. While they knew they could never conquer America, they held an iron belief that America could never conquer them. And this brings us to the final, chilling chapter: the invasion that was actually planned. As the tide of war turned, as the sleeping giant woke and began its relentless march across the Pacific, the United States faced the very question Japan had shrunk from. What would it take to invade the Japanese homeland? The plan was called Operation Downfall, scheduled for late 1945 and 1946, and it was, in every sense, the Japanese nightmare in reverse, but with one terrible difference. The American plan called for the largest beach landing in human history. Far bigger than D-Day, it would involve over 1.5 million Allied troops. The first landing, called Operation Olympic, would hit the southern island of Kyushu. The second, called Operation Coronet, would strike near Tokyo itself. The American planners, men like General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz, began to calculate the costs. They looked at the geography of Japan. They looked at the fanatical resistance they had faced on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese soldiers and even civilians fought to the last person, often taking their own lives rather than surrendering. And then they looked at what the Japanese High Command was planning for the defense of their homeland. The Japanese defense plan was called Ketsugo, meaning decisive operation, and it was essentially a plan for national suicide. Having failed to stop the American war machine at sea, the High Command decided to stake everything on a final, apocalyptic battle on the beaches of their homeland. But this time, they wouldn't just be using their army. They were preparing to use the very same armed citizen strategy that Yamamoto had feared in America. The Japanese government began to mobilize the entire population. They dissolved schools to put children to work in factories. They were training civilians, women, old men and boys, not with rifles because they had none to spare, but with bamboo spears, with kitchen knives, with anything that could be used as a weapon. They were forming what they called Patriotic Citizens Fighting Corps. And the plan was simple. When the first American soldiers set foot on the beach, every single man, woman, and child in Japan would throw themselves at the invaders in a final suicidal wave. They were building thousands of suicide planes and explosive motorboats designed not to win the battle, but simply to cause such staggering casualties that the Americans would finally lose their nerve. This was the ultimate tragic irony. The Japanese leaders who had deemed an invasion of America impossible because of its armed, stubborn people were now banking their entire survival on becoming that very thing. And when American planners saw this, their casualty estimates were beyond anything the world had ever seen. They projected that the United States alone would suffer 400,000 to over 1 million casualties in the invasion of Japan, with at least 100,000 to 500,000 deaths. Japanese casualties, they estimated, would be in the tens of millions. The entire nation would be destroyed. This was the context in which President Harry Truman, who had just taken office after Roosevelt's death, was presented with a choice. On one hand, Operation Downfall, a path that would lead to the deaths of millions, including 1 million of his own men. On the other hand, a new terrible weapon, a secret project that had just been successfully tested in the New Mexico desert, the atomic bomb. The decision to use the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains one of the most debated and painful moments in modern history. But to understand it, we must understand the alternative. The alternative was Operation Downfall, an invasion that would have made every other battle in the war look small by comparison. The Japanese High Command, by embracing the very strategy they so feared, had accidentally made the cost of a regular invasion so unthinkably high that it forced this unthinkable weapon to become a reality. In the end, Yamamoto was right about everything. He was right about the sleeping giant. He was right about the terrible determination. And he was right that invading a determined, armed and vast nation was a form of military suicide. His wisdom was in seeing the truth when everyone else was blinded by victory. And the tragedy is that his own nation, in its final desperate moments, was forced to prove his theory correct. The legacy of this story isn't simple. It's a complex lesson in humility, in the dangers of underestimating an opponent, and in the profound, often frightening power of a people united in defense of their homeland. It's a reminder that the greatest strength of a nation isn't always found in its soldiers or its ships, but in its factories, its geography, and in the unshakable character of its people. And these stories of that generation, their sacrifices and their determination, remain our shared inheritance worth remembering.